Welcome to the Trawl Free Table podcast from Fish Alaska Magazine, proudly sponsored by Salmon State and the Cannery Restaurant in Homer. I'm Melissa Norris, publisher of Fish Alaska and Hunt Alaska magazines. I'm joined today by my co-host, David Bays, the force behind the Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch Facebook group. This series expands on our magazine column, The Trawl Free Table, an effort to inform and spark honest dialogue about how industrial trawling affects Alaska's fisheries, communities, and ecosystems. We look beyond the labels to examine seafood certification systems, management practices, and the choices we can make as consumers to keep oceans thriving. Today's interview is a good one and proof that commercial and sport fishing can easily work together in the name of fisheries conservation. Our guest is a Sitka-based commercial longline fisherman, the executive director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, past council member on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, serving 3 consecutive 3-year terms, and an active fisheries conservationist who received the 25th Heinz Award for the environment for her sustainable fishing advocacy work and support for rural fishing communities of Alaska. David and I are thrilled to share this conversation today with Linda Behnken. I know we've got a lot of questions for you today. I don't want to blather on. I know David's got some questions for you too. Can you just start with a little bit about your background, let folks know who you are and what you do down there in Sitka?
I have lived in Sitka now most of my life. I came up here when I was 19, sort of vague ideas of getting a job on a commercial fishing boat, and knew before I got off the ferry, this is where I wanted to live. I just really fell in love with the place, and it took me a while to find a job on a fishing boat. There were even less women working on fishing boats then. But once I did, I love that too. Commercial fishing ever since, bought my own boat, have worked as crew and run my own longliner trawler since then. Fish with my family now and raise both our kids on the boat. So long history in commercial fishing, and then also went to graduate school. And when I came back from graduate school, took the job running Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association and continue to serve in that capacity. Also helped start the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust that really works to help bring back access to fisheries to our smaller rural communities.
So can you explain some of that to everyone? First of all, let's back up and just baseline. We're talking gear fishing today. We're going to be talking about trawl. So yeah, just basic understanding of how longline fishing operates for folks.
Yeah, so longline fishing is hook and line fishing, where a line with hooks along it that are individually baited is set. It's anchored to the seafloor. It's left to, we say, soak for a certain amount of time. And then we go back and haul the line back and get the fish off the line.
Okay, great. And what species are you targeting?
So we mostly target halibut and sablefish with long lines in this part of the Gulf of Alaska.
Okay, great. Yeah, Linda and I met because she so graciously shared a sablefish recipe for the Trawl Free Table Recipe Department in Fish Alaska in the February issue. So thank you. Yeah, so you are the director of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, and that a lot of what you do is based on that role. And you've also received the Heinz Award for your work with conservation. And so I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on that too.
So yeah, a big part of my role with ALFA is learning from fishermen and getting fishermen involved in fisheries management. I just find people who spend a lot of time on the water, whether they're commercial fishing or sport fishing, they just have a knowledge of the ocean that is just immensely valuable to people who are making decisions about the science and management of our resource. They're also incredibly good problem solvers. You have to be if you're way offshore and things go wrong and you're the only one there to try and fix it and get yourself home safely. So I just really like to bring fishermen in to address conservation issues and to be more involved in management. And we have, as an organization, just worked to improve the sustainability of our fisheries and the health of our fishing communities, fishing fleets.
Excellent. What are some of the programs that you guys have worked on?
So we've gotten fishermen involved in a number of conservation issues. A big one is mapping habitat and also mapping areas where fishermen encounter rockfish as bycatch. Rockfish are just really long lived, slow to reproduce species. And if they're overfished, it can take a really long time for them to recover. I mean, they can live 80 to 120 years, some of the species. So helping our fishermen understand where their bycatch rates were high and why. So overlaying those catch rates over the bathymetry of the seafloor so they could help to avoid those high profile and rocky pinnacly areas where rockfish like to hang out is one conservation issue we've worked on quite a bit to address our own bycatch challenges. And then we've helped to develop electronic monitoring for our boats that are too small to carry observers or didn't feel like having an observer on board really worked well with the size of their vessel, but then to provide that higher level of accountability for catch back to managers. For years, we have had challenges with sperm whales taking blackcod off of our hooks and worked with fishermen to understand how the whales were doing that and test out deterrents, think about alternative gear to try and keep the whales away from the boats and from getting entangled, and also make sure that fishermen were able to keep the fish that they were catching and not lose so much to whales. So, yeah, those are some of the higher profile ones.
Exciting. Yeah. So you also helped initiate a program called Alaskans Own, which is a catch share program, essentially. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we, despite, being in a small town right on the ocean, often heard from people here in Sitka that they just didn't have access to locally caught fish. If they didn't have a boat and didn't have a way to get out and catch fish, they weren't able to get the fresh fish they wanted. So we started Alaskan Zone as a community supported fishery, similar to community supported agriculture or CSAs, where people buy a subscription and then they get fish from us once a month. And over 4 months or 6 months or sort of the subscription base that worked for them for 2 people, 4 people, whatever their family needed. We started it here in Sitka. Then we got requests from some of the adjacent communities to also provide a subscription service there. So we've broadened it to include Juneau and Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Seattle. And then we also direct ship fish to people around the country that place an order with us. So we do the subscription and we do direct shipping, and we are getting fish that's processed locally, caught by our fishermen, and then shared around the country. And then profits from that go back into our conservation work or our seafood distribution work to help families in need.
And I want to hear more about that seafood distribution work, but I want to also comment that what drew me to your program was that you explicitly stated that it was non-trawl caught fish, right? And so you're specific about how it's caught, your gear, and you made my initial list for non-trawl supporting businesses in Alaska that we can all look to for our seafood resources when we can't catch our own.
Yeah,
Go
probably
ahead.
the conservation initiative I should have started with is when I first took over running ALFA, I sort of told the board I would take the job if I could work to close Southeast Alaska to trawling. I just saw it as, I mean, I had longline near trawl vessels when they came through here, and I saw it as a unsustainable gear type, particularly in this area that has a high abundance of deep water corals and sort of sensitive habitat, and is just really important to the small communities that live here in the fishing fleets based here. So it took almost 8 years to accomplish that goal, but we were able to get this area closed to trawling. And that means that any fish that's caught in Southeast Alaska is caught with pots or hook and line gear types.
It's a really good point to make. I'll highlight that. If you can narrow it down to region, at least you know those questionable species would be then specifically non-trawl. Excellent. Yes. Well, we want to hear so much more about that whole 8 years and what it took and all of that. And I know David has questions. So, I mean, how'd you start? Tell us everything you had to do to make that happen.
Well, the trigger for taking it to the council was there was a trawler headed for the Bering Sea that came, as it came through Southeast Alaska, it dropped its net just to test it and make sure everything was working. And they did 1 or 2 passes and then kept going. But in those 1 or 2 passes, they took enough rockfish, demersal shelf rockfish, as bycatch to close down our local fishery for the whole year. We had a small directed fishery on demersal shelf rockfish then. and also to raise issues about whether it could trigger closures of the halibut fishery, because some rockfish can be taken as bycatch in that halibut fishery, up to 10% of your halibut on board. And so we put in an emergency request to the council to close Southeast Alaska to trawling. That was approved by the council, but that's temporary. You have to follow it with a permanent action. And we then did follow that with a request to make it permanent. But in that amount of time, there was a huge amount of pushback from the trawl industry against that, and also actually from NIMPs that didn't want to see us set a precedent that trawling was not acceptable in a part of Alaska. So we lost it the first time around. And then it took a lot of years of work of we got resolutions from every community in Southeast Alaska in support of closing the area to trawling. We got one from the Alaska State Legislature. We had the support of our congressional delegation at the time. And then we finally found a way to sort of incorporate it into another amendment, bigger sort of fisheries management bill that was moving at the council. And that's how we got it passed. And it was implemented in 1998. So started the process in 91, 92, and implemented towards the end of 98.
What we hear a lot now from like people in the legislature, and there's this kind of concern at Congress of like, hey, we can't do anything. This is just the governor. It's just NIMS. How did that come about in your example? Do you remember like what the legislature
Well,
could do now? Or
right. Yeah. At the time, the state was very united in saying that trawling was an unacceptable gear type in this area. And certainly the legislature couldn't force the council to act, and Congress couldn't force the council to act. They tried to delegate that authority to the council and stay out of that. But knowing that that support was there, both in state and back east, to make sure this would make it all the way through. Because what's acted on and advised on by the North Pacific Council then has to be approved by the Secretary of Commerce. So knowing there was that support back east for the trawl closure in southeast, I think helped the council feel confident in including it in this fishery management package.
had there been a lot of, did you guys spend a lot of time focused on like, did you have access to cameras to do like before and after of trawl in Southeast? I think I've spoken with some people that said they were big into like that, the footage of trawl.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of that. We had a little bit from off of Washington showing, a trawl going along the bottom. We had some footage from a submersible up here showing what those coral heads can look like in
Mm.
Southeast. And then there was a study that had been done for looking at the outer continental shelf for potential oil development that had documented the high abundance relative to the rest of the Gulf of sensitive habitat and corals in Southeast Alaska that I relied on quite a bit for the information I provided to the council. And then also that shelf slope break is way closer to the shore in southeast than it is when you get further west, which means that area, which is where black cod live and it's just a very rich sort of fishable grounds, is a lot more accessible for small boats down here than when you go farther west, and there's just a bigger fleet of small boats because of that. So that was also part of our argument at the time of this place is really sort of uniquely important to small boats. I think you could certainly make the same argument that all the way across the Gulf of Alaska, there are small boat fleets, there are commercial sport charter businesses that depend on the same fisheries across the whole Gulf of Alaska.
Melissa, were you about to say something? I think I cut you.
No, I was just mouth agape.
What was the most substantial or like the best or most valid maybe trawl pushback you had, Linda? A lot of people, when we discuss this with them now, say, what's trawl going to say back to us, and why does that? They say that they make a ton of money is really, and that's how it's always been, is the kind of the NIMS explanation. But what did you run into?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time, those trawlers were Washington based. They weren't. That was before there was such an investment in the trawl sector from Alaska, from the CQE groups. So it was an easier issue for Alaskans to get behind than it is now. And there was nobody in Southeast Alaska that was making their living from trawling. which is also different between, here and the Gulf of Alaska at this point, where you now have, trawlers based in Kodiak and King Cove and some of these other communities in the Gulf of Alaska. It's a little bit, it's a tougher decision when Alaskans are also directly impacted.
What was the NIMS argument essentially for preserving it or wanting to not set the precedent?
Well, when we initially pitched the emergency rule and the longer term request, part of our argument was that, this area has smaller quotas. It's difficult for NIMS to manage and stay under catch limits. That was before IFQs were in place. And we were regularly going over catch limits for blackcod and sometimes for halibut. They just, would try and estimate how much effort there would be and when to close the season. And we would often overshoot. And I think they didn't like us saying they couldn't manage the fisheries in this area. And then that was addressed more with the quota program. And I think there was some nervousness about talking about impacts to habitat. Or, we also talked about sea lions. And at that time, sea lions in Southeast, the stellar sea lion population was still robust compared to the big declines we were seeing farther west. And so we pitched it that we should be, use this as an area, sort of bastion of keeping those sea lion populations healthy. And I don't think they like that so much either. So when we rolled this into the plan that eventually moved forward, we were really focused more on the socioeconomics of maintaining the healthy small boat community-based fisheries that were based in Southeast Alaska versus the impacts that we could have from, a few industrial size trawl boats going through here.
Interesting. I tried to get a number of trawl vessels in a specific number and I couldn't find anything published. And I'd like to know even beyond that, who's Alaskan and who's not. Yeah. Because if it's just a handful, you figure we could find a way to redirect their efforts.
Hang on one second. We got the tsunami while I'm going off here.
We understand if you have to go.
No, they just test it every day at noon. So I don't know, maybe you can't even hear it, but sometimes it feels loud in the house. Yeah,
we're
it's done
and
now.
That wraps this episode of the Trawl Free Table.
We got to go to higher ground. No, it's amazingly small number, actually. Like the Amendment 80 fleet is quite small. There were 20 some. I think they're down to 16 that are actually fishing anymore. I don't know the count of Kodiak-based trawlers, but I could certainly find it if that's a number you're looking for.
I'd like to know. Yeah, I'm trying to have a full understanding of this gigantic issue. There's so much to it.
I think back to your, the financial flow question of it, I think Lainey Welch has sent a piece that said about 76% of ground fish profits go to Seattle. So I think essentially with the insinuation that the rest would come to Alaska, essentially. So that gives you a starting point. It doesn't give you the fleet number, but.
Yeah, and it doesn't talk about necessarily personal income, right? Yeah, it's a little vague. Okay, one question I have for you is, do you want to see the rest of the state cut off too?
I think there's a real strong need to protect benthic habitat from the impact of bottom trawling. I'm particularly concerned now that we've learned how much impact on the bottom and the seafloor there is from midwater trawling, pelagic trawling that we all thought was not on bottom. And to me, that's, one of the two top priorities right now for the council will bycatch, and what's going on in the Bering Sea, but relative to trawling specifically in the Gulf of Alaska would be getting those midwater nets off bottom, or saying you can't troll in times and places that are close to bottom trawling unless you can prove your contact with the seafloor is very limited or non-existent. And then the other is addressing these halibut bycatch caps in the Gulf, which are right now way higher than the abundance of halibut would suggest is reasonable.
I've been trying to explain lately the performance standard on crab in midwater trawl and how being on bottom with a midwater trawl isn't actually banned. It just comes down to how many crab you have in a tow. Are you familiar with that enough to give an overview?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, those were set quite a long time ago. And the idea was the thinking was we didn't have a good way to document benthic contact or seafloor contact by the gear. So we would have sort of a proxy for performance. And if you are pulling up crab or crab parts, then your net's probably on the bottom. And I think that was maybe reasonable, although of course it then inspires net designers to figure out ways to not have crab parts come up as opposed to not have the net be on the bottom. And those can be two different things. And then also, since we've seen this big crash in the crab stocks, it's a lot less of a meaningful performance standard. If there are less crab out there, you're going to catch less whether you're on the bottom or not. This is when we have a really enhanced concern about crab. So it's a poor performance standard at this point and something that council really needs to revise.
For sure, yeah. And just for context for people, this crab performance standard had essentially said that if a midwater net is towed and brought up and it brings up less than 20 crab in the net, then they'll essentially decide it was a legal tow and functionally hadn't been midwater because it didn't get its full 20 crab. But if it caught 21 crab, then it was on bottom and then it was a problem. But then they said that crab parts in the net didn't necessarily count because those could have been thrown up by fish, or they said that crab less than 1.5 inches wide across their back didn't count because those could have been thrown up by a fish in the net. And then the net design had evolved. So now they have the leading cable, the foot rope that drags on the bottom, but they put in these large panels. I think they said it's a 56-inch wide panel right behind the net, behind the foot rope, so that anything heavy, essentially, the foot rope passes over, it might stir it up, but then it falls out, which means it doesn't get up to the deck of the boat to be tallied. If the bycatch doesn't come up to the deck, then it didn't happen. So yeah, as Linda was saying, it used to be that we weren't sure, but now they have the trawl nets with like a 500-foot tall opening, and they might fish in a 250-foot deep area of the Bering Sea, and they say it's a midwater net. So logic just is lost or out the window.
So, should we talk about current efforts?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about like the Gulf, the halibut bycatch limit in the Gulf versus what other fleets catch?
I think maybe the starting point for that conversation is that we worked for a lot of years. I think that was a 6-year effort to get abundance-based management of halibut bycatch in the Bering Sea. It was a really significant effort led by Central Bering Sea Fishermen's Association, the folks in the Pripolofts that were really watching their halibut resource disappear, but trawling continued to happen and take halibut as bycatch right off their shore out there in the middle of the Bering Sea. And a lot of us worked with them, as sort of allies and supporters in that effort, and was eventually successful, tested in the courts, and still upheld. So the bycatch limits were reduced to reflect the reduced abundance of halibut, and they will ratchet up or down based on what happens with halibut abundance in the future. But in the Gulf, we still have a cap that was set a very long time ago, and it was set when halibut were a whole lot more abundant in the Gulf. My concern, it's good that the trawl fleet is below it, that their bycatch is so far below that cap, but that if we see, and we all are hoping for, some good year classes of baby halibut come into the population, that they could really be hard hit by trawlers, and there would be no repercussion, no shutdown of trawling, because it would take them a while to hit that cap. And in the meantime, we could really compromise the rebuilding potential of the stock. And, the spawning biomass of halibut is at historic low levels. We're all really eager to see some strong year classes, and we all want to safeguard them for the future. Yeah, just really important to have the council take a look at lowering that cap.
That strong year class thing's really interesting because I don't think people understand the fish biology component. People think they breed, they reproduce, and it just always is pretty level. But I think a lot of the reality is you'll have one amazing year for spawning or survival that essentially feeds the next 20 or 30 years of a population. Can you run us through the black cod event and the big overages by trawl? I think that's feeding into this concern for what might happen.
Yeah. No one fully understands what drives those successful year classes, because you're right, the fish are spawning every year. But some years we see these really successful recruitment events. And in the late 80s, there was one of those for halibut. And we've really been fishing off that big boom or big year class for a long time. It's now really dying out of our fisheries. And there hasn't been a strong year class of halibut for a good 8 years. We sort of had this gap, 6 to 8 years, and we're really waiting to see that. But in blackcod, we had a similar situation where we had some really strong year classes in the late 80s, early 90s. And then it had been a long time of year classes being below average and the spawning biomass just going down and down and down. And then actually during the years of the warm blob here in the Gulf, we had 4 spectacular year classes that have really swelled the population. Of course, it takes 7 years for black cod to be mature and able to spawn themselves. So, we had a lot of small immature fish in the population. I know our group was really pushing to not raise the quotas until those fish were bigger, sexually mature, because we are going to be counting on them to sustain the fisheries and the populations far into the future. The trawlers pushed to bump up the catch limits after they took so many in the Bering Sea that they were, one year they discarded 7 million pounds. Then they pushed for an increase in the quota in the Bering Sea, and then they were able to secure a directed fishery in the Bering Sea on black cod. So we've seen a huge influx of small baby black cod into the market that, to my mind, it's not good for the resource. It certainly wasn't good for the markets. It really crashed the value of the sablefish stock. Just poor management, all around of that rebuilding potential of the stock. And I really don't want to repeat that mistake with halibut if we're lucky enough to see some strong year classes move in to the Gulf and Bering Sea. And there's some hope that the 2016, 2017 year classes for halibut might be above average. Too soon to know. But yeah, time is now to get those protections in place.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing I remember on the black cod, especially, I think it was 2021, that they were at 515% of essentially their set aside or bycatch allocation, which set off all kinds of red flags. But then the trawl response was, it's not our fault. There's just a lot of black cod around and we can't help catching 500%. But then it was really interesting. NPFMC and NIMS reaction to that wasn't necessarily to figure out how to have them catch less black. Instead, over a couple of years, they've just ratcheted up how much they're allowed to take up to that essentially 515% overage they've initially had. And they put out these papers that say, well, the trawlers can't afford to be tied to the dock because of black cod, or if they avoid black cod, maybe they'll catch something else. And now on top of that, they've said, well, we don't want to have to throw back this bycatch, so maybe we'll just let them sell it, which are just, this cascade of regulatory changes that we don't think any other fisherman or other industry would ever see, which brings up the bigger questions of how NIMS and the NPFMC are favoring trawl, or if they are.
Yeah, I mean, in the Bering Sea, the trawl fleet does have 50% of the allocation on black cod. It's just that when the numbers were lower, they weren't allowed to direct target on those black cod. It was a bycatch allowance in their other fisheries. But once they got that allocation pushed up high enough, then they had a directed fishery. And that, incidentally, is also when they took orcas as bycatch, when they went and targeted black cod. And I know they've worked to try and prevent doing that again. But yeah, we were pretty horrified to see that 5 to 7 million pound discard. And then just to see the changes that made it, well, not a discard, but a retention. And then all of that really pretty poor quality fish and also immature fish that, is then killed and put on the market. So to me, it's bad for the resource, bad for the markets, just like not good management, not making the most of the rebuilding potential that we were gifted. We never know when we're going to get another. And also the value of the resource to our fisheries or communities or country, at whatever level you want to look at it.
I think that's become huge with like the Bering Sea halibut nurseries too. I think in 2015, their average bycatch halibut out there was 4.76 pounds. And I think they start to spawn at 8 or 10 pounds. So you've got these halibut that have really made it through the gauntlet of life. I mean, hardly any of them survive the egg phase, the larval phase. Real small halibut get eaten by everything, but there's not that much out there that eats a 5-pound halibut, so the odds that those make it into being something that's going to spawn in just 2 more years, is getting pretty high. And I think we see the same thing with 20-inch black cod. They've made it through these big gauntlets in life, but if they don't get a spawn once, it's like the farmer wiping out all his eggs and wondering why he doesn't have any more chickens.
Exactly. Yeah. And you really don't get many halibut biting hooks until they're closer to that spawning, sort of mature stage. But we also have a limit. We can't keep fish under 32 inches because they're not mature. We want them to grow. We want them to contribute to the spawning biomass before you take them. But then yes, this juxtaposition where, the trawl fleet, well, pretty much what they're taking is not, the mortality is so high that if they catch it, you don't want them putting them back in the water. It's probably not going to make it. But anyway, we have a high mortality on those small fish in that trawl sector. And the IPHC has zero management control over that bycatch.
I think the IPHC has recommended in the past that those halibut nurseries get shut down, but it seems like they've softened up or got tired of sending that letter. Do you have history on that?
Yeah, when the foreign trawl fleets were operating, off of Alaska, there were areas that were closed to trawling. Well, it was closed to all fishing to protect those nursery grounds for small halibut. Now they're only closed to the directed fishery, and trawling can happen in there. So the domestic fisheries are in there. We have asked a number of times of the IPHC of is there specific areas? Are these still the right areas that we would want to close? And they have said, well, there's, probably nursery areas all over the Bering Sea. If we had to tell you these are the right ones, we could do that. But really, the Bering Sea is in effect a nursery area for halibut. It is for blackcod too. They sort of float with the tide when they're little or with the prevailing current to the Bering Sea. And then as they grow in strength and size and settle to the bottom, as in the case of halibut, they start to swim back to the Gulf. So the Bering Sea really feeds the Gulf of Alaska. And if that movement is interrupted in the Bering Sea, you don't see that sort of current of life coming back into the Gulf.
And that's written up as those halibut in theory migrate from the Bering Sea all the way down to Washington, Oregon. I guess how that one of the Homer halibut derby tagged fish was caught in Washington or Oregon or multiple.
Yeah, some as far as California. I mean, those fish go off to see the world.
Yeah. They'd like to.
Yeah, they would like to. Yeah, and Canada too, of course. BC is all part of that migratory, spawning biomass contribution and then migration back.
What back to the Gulf of Alaska numbers? Do you have the details on what their bycatch limit is now versus what the directed TAC is? Do you have that in front of you?
I don't have it in front of me. I mean, they've been at a half to a third of their bycatch caps. I can certainly, look up those numbers and send them to you. But yeah, I think that's where my concern is that we really have this big gap. And we have that gap because there's just not that many halibut around right now.
Mm-hmm.
If you could encourage folks, just the general public, what do you want to see out of this, Linda? What do you want them to know?
I think it's really important that people weigh in with the North Pacific Council about their concerns with bycatch, which I think we're seeing more and more of people speaking out about that and the need to take some meaningful action to protect the resource. And then the other really big issue right now is that, if we're going to call a net pelagic, it should be off the bottom. And we shouldn't be allowing pelagic nets that are on the bottom to be operating at times and in places that are closed to bottom trawling. We have habitat concerns. We have bycatch concerns. We have crab stocks in trouble in the Bering Sea. We have halibut stocks at low levels. We have king salmon we're worried about. That really there needs to be a lot of heightened care taken of habitat and of those species that are so important to Alaskans. And they should think about I think what you're doing is just think about when you buy fish, how it was caught and what the impact of your choice as a consumer can have on how fish is caught and who is catching the fish. If you don't catch it yourself, ask questions about how that fish was caught.
Absolutely. David, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think too that maybe not everybody knows the acronym or the terminology when Linda talked about abundance-based management of halibut in the Bering Sea or halibut bycatch taking 6 years to go into effect. What that basically does is it just says it's like a banking account or a financial budget for a family, that the more halibut are in the water in general, the more can be caught as bycatch because essentially the resource can afford to lose fish. And that's what we do with every other fishery. The longline quota floats up and down. The charter quota floats up and down as halibut stocks go up and down, just like we could spend more money if we have more money. But the way a lot of the trawl quotas were set was 25 years ago when there was a ton of halibut. They said, okay, there's 100 million pounds of halibut in the Bering Sea. You guys can catch 10 million pounds. And nobody cared in a way where it didn't impact everyone else the way it does now. But those, instead of becoming floating quotas like it does for everybody else, they said that was fixed. They said, yeah, in 1990, we picked 10 million pounds as the number. And now it's 25 plus years later. And it's still at 10 million pounds, even if the entire biomass has gone down to 25 million pounds or whatever. So instead of it used to be 10%, now it's close to maybe 50%. And so that's been a big ask for people, and that's what we are looking at. And the concern in the Gulf of Alaska, that's become a concern with king salmon and chum salmon in the Bering Sea. Chum salmon doesn't have any bycatch limit, but the ones for king salmon were set when stocks were a concern, but not totally crashed like this. But they're still high and fixed, which is really just a regulatory ism, I guess. And we get sued or the NPFMC gets sued if they try and change it.
Yeah, and it seems very incongruous that we would manage. I mean, Alaska manages fisheries on abundance based, and why would we manage the bycatch fishery any differently? We did put in a request to the council last year to start the process for abundance-based management of halibut bycatch in the Gulf, following on the decisions and the defense of the decisions in the Bering Sea to go that route. And that's an action the council hasn't taken up yet. But I think we need people to push them to do that.
It just sits there in wasteland with no communication.
Yeah, you submit it as a, understaffed tasking, asking them to initiate an amendment, assign staff to work on this, develop an analysis. And if no council member makes a motion to do that, it just sits there. So we'll have to come back to the council and ask again. I thought we had members of the council who were ready to make a motion to get it started, and they backed away from it. So we have to make sure we have some champions on the council ready to move that forward and the support to do that. And really what that takes is a lot of public pressure, I think, is what we found.
I think on the interesting thing that's come up on the council is that there's 11 voting seats, and quite a few of them are held by people that currently work for corporations vested in Trawl. But there's also some other seats on there. So there's one charter rep, there's one person that works for the crabbing organization. We get a lot of questions, well, why don't those people put forward this motion? And the answer, whether it's right or wrong or ethical or not, is that the crabbers have to rely on the rest of the NPFMC to get their policy passed at some point, as do the charter people, as does everybody else. And so there's this kind of, I guess you could say, mafia-esque concern within the NPFMC that if the charter guy, if you don't vote with us on Trawl, or if we see you putting forward these resolutions that are going to shut down Trawl, then when you need a charter limit passed in the future, everybody else is going to vote against you. And that might not be explicitly said, but that's the concern we hear over and over. You'd been on the NPFMC, I think, Linda, but in a different setting, maybe. Was that less of a issue 10 or 15 years ago?
Well, I guess I always feel like when you go on the council, you take an oath that you're not there to represent your constituency. You're there to manage the resource sustainability first. You take an oath to that and to represent all users fairly and equitably. And I think, but nevertheless, when you're up there, if you don't have the votes to make a motion on something, you have to calculate whether it's worth making that statement anyway and go down in flames, or working behind the scenes, talking to people, asking the public to put pressure on other council members, showing them data, helping them understand why this is the right thing to do before you make that motion, so that you have a reasonable chance or some confidence that it's going to pass. And I think we have representatives on the council who that's the calculus they're thinking through. For example, John Kurland, who's National Marine Fisheries Service Regional Director, has made the motion twice that we define pelagic trawl as having limited seafloor contact. He didn't have enough votes to initiate that action. He pulled no votes the first time he made it, and I think he pulled 2 on his side the next time. So, he's not going to make that motion again until he thinks he has enough momentum for council members to support him on moving that forward.
I think the other thing, back to Melissa a little bit to your question, is that the NPFMC had formerly relied pretty heavily on the state of Alaska ADFG commissioner to put forward some of those more contentious, real Alaska first motions that even if it went down in flames, that's not a nominated seat. Essentially, whoever the governor is gets to pick that seat, and it's there and solid. But we haven't seen a great job of that in the last. Obviously, there's politics in the background, but I think others in the past had done better. And there's a lot of hope that the next governor will choose an ADFG commissioner that's more bold in how they take that on, and realizing that even if it goes down in flames, at least it gets the conversation started.
Absolutely. And people should know that the governor also nominates the other, Alaska seats on the council. So the governor plays a very key role when they have a seat designated for the state of Alaska, but also they have the opportunity to nominate people to those other seats. So having people who are up there that have a very Alaska first or resource conservation first perspective, yeah, the governor has a big role to play in that. And your vote for governor has a big role to play in who our next governor is. So that's also important for people to understand.
So, Linda, when do the NPFMC board members, council members, get appointed?
It's on a rolling basis. They have 3-year terms, each member. And as they come up, there's a nomination process in March and then confirmation by the Secretary of Commerce in August, usually of each year. Some years it's gone a little later, but yeah, and it's on a rolling basis.
Interesting thing I've seen with that through the charter organizations is there's kind of this intimidation or perceived intimidation factor too of say that somebody, say it's a Trawl rep, is on the NPFMC and they're coming up for renomination and everybody kind of understands it's a slam dunk that they're going to make it. Then we've had this pressure of like, well, you charter guys better write in a letter supporting this person because if you don't, they're going to get on there anyways. And now you haven't supported them. You just set yourself up for disaster in the future. Makes this really tough dynamic and kind of supports this. I don't know. It's not a good culture of being rewarded for asking more questions or asking tough questions. It's kind of being insinuated that you would be rewarded if you asked less or if you kind of played softball with the bigger issues, which is unfortunate for democracy, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to, well, organizations at least, to send lists of questions to candidates and to get their position, in writing on the issues that matter most to your organization. And to decide whether you endorse a candidate or not based on, whether they're aligning with your values.
You'll find it fun to know that David and I anticipate inviting all of the gubernatorial candidates to come on and have a podcast with us too.
Great. Good. I
We
think
want to hear
that's
their
really
stance on
important.
Trawl.
Yeah. Yep. Well, the way it's been polling in state, it should be a big issue in this next gubernatorial race. People are clearly, Alaskans are really paying attention, know what it is, know what the risks are, and are concerned.
I'd be interested to see who you decide to back, Linda, and who the ALFA backs, because I respect
Yeah, well,
everything
we
you're
are a
doing.
501c3, so we can't, ALFA
Oh, you
can't
can't.
back, but I certainly can.
Well, we'll share an email.
Can you walk us through? There's been quite a bit of confusion about what congressional reps might do or have done in the past, I guess. Mary Peltola had been working on updating national standards and the interpretation of that. Can you give us a rundown of what that was and why it wasn't an act of Congress and why that might still be an open door for other people?
Yeah, so the national standards are what set the guidelines for how the council makes its decisions. And those are what they're also then measured by if a decision by the council is taken to court. Like, were you in compliance with the national standards? And the national standards are part of the Magnuson Act, which is a congressional action and sort of the organic act for federal fisheries management in our country. So yeah, the standards range from optimal yield, like get the most value out of the resource you can, to provide for the sustained participation by fishery dependent communities and reduce bycatch to the extent practicable, provide for safety. There's this list of national standards and they get to balance them, and how heavily they lean on one over is what they have to speak to on the record and then can get tested in court. And we have felt like that provide for the sustained participation of fishing communities and reduce bycatch to the extent practicable had gotten a little bit short shrift by the council, just was not guiding council actions or prioritizing enough of a priority in council actions. So we had asked under the previous administration, NOAA to take a hard look at that and see whether there should be some additional guidelines, updating of guidelines to direct the council on how to balance the national standards. When the administration changed, that whole process stopped. This administration hasn't picked it up. So that effort kind of came to a screeching halt. But Mary Peltola had also introduced an amendment saying we want the councils to define pelagic trawl as having limited seafloor contact. If the council doesn't come up with a definition, then maybe Congress will, just sort of putting them on notice. We know this is your job. Please do your job. And if you don't, we're your backstop. And I haven't seen anybody else pick up that action or that amendment back there. When we lost Mary, it was certainly a big champion for fisheries. And that's not moving, but it certainly could be by a member of our delegation.
Yeah, national standards and Magnuson-Stevens are hard for people to understand, but I've compared the national standards to like the 10 Commandments. So you have the whole Bible is like the whole Magnuson-Stevens Act, 300 pages, but the national standards say are the rules that you live by, essentially, or the rules that the new laws are supposed to live by. But the one that always comes up is that to reduce the bycatch to the extent practicable versus optimum yield, make a lot of money. And I think Trawl has sued successfully, essentially on like leveraging number 1 against number 9. Can you talk through what that argument is, or why it works, or why dropping to the extent practicable would change the dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, that's, how do you define practicable and how much cost can you impose on the industry, say the trawl sector, in trying to minimize their bycatch or avoid bycatch? So whenever you look at the economics of what those halibut that they might not bycatch are compared to the, millions of pounds of flatfish that might be that might be forgone, that's sort of the trade-off that the council has to think about, and that where economists will focus. And there have been times in court where the council has lost based on an argument they've made around that balancing. But with the abundance-based management of halibut in the Bering Sea, for example, the government persevered in saying we have to reduce this bycatch. There's some conservation concern, but there's also a huge impact to our fishing communities, to the tribal entities that are so dependent on this resource, to sport, to, sort of the whole range of users of the halibut resource. So, it's gone both ways. And winning that action in the Bering Sea on abundance-based bycatch management was a really big win, I think, for our effort to take care of these important Alaska species. I'm really happy to hear you're going to have the governor candidates come on because I've talked to a couple of them already, and this is definitely on their radar. So a couple of them have been asking me about the legislation in state and what role the legislature should play, and that it might be a good question to ask of them.
Yeah.
We all feel like that, fisheries management should be science-based, and we have the councils, we have the Board of Fish to make those decisions. But I think the fact that there's such building frustration in state about how fisheries are being managed is why we're starting to see these amendments pop up in Congress and pop up, with the legislature. And it just means there needs to be more attention paid by the managing agencies to these decisions if they want to maintain that control of the process.
Well, Mike Crunk's got that SB 161, I think, in on trawl in state waters. And there's been the feedback I've got is that Kathy Giesel isn't letting it out of, I think, the Natural Resources Committee, or doesn't want a young or freshman congressman or something to get rubber stamped on something. I don't know. But anyways, if one of the interesting things I saw was that if it comes up to this vote in the full legislature, then the entire state legislature is going to have to pick all 60 people, one side or the other, of whether or not they want it to happen, which will be a revealing scenario, I think, or something that'll at least get people thinking about it. So that's something to push for, is to push that to a vote, I think, so that people have to pick a side.
Yeah, there's also, actions, proposals in front of the Board of Fisheries at the statewide meeting in March around trawling and, pelagic trawling and observers on trawlers. And so that's another place for people to pay attention. And
I thought we were out of the cycle. Didn't they do fish last year? Or are you talking about in
27?
No,
statewide meeting in March. There's 3 proposals that a coalition of groups that we are part of have put forward.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for that and help push those messages out for sure through our respective audiences. It's important. I guess I want to know, like, are any of these gubernatorial candidates already thinking about, and who's really qualified to be the commissioner, and who's qualified to be on the NPFMC board? Can anybody throw their hat in the ring?
Sure. I mean, for the council,
Yeah, like I'd like a list of like 20 qualified people we can all kind of know and say, make suggestions to who's coming in, who we all think is on the right side of, Alaskans when it comes to being our next governor. And can we then influence who their trusted appointees are?
I think absolutely. I think when you talk to the candidates, to ask them about if they have someone in mind yet for commissioner, if they don't have a person in mind, what are the qualities they're looking for? What are the values that they're going to look for, or what kind of guidelines are they going to give their commissioner, and likewise for people they might appoint to the council. I imagine a lot of them will be not quite ready to name council members at this point, but they could tell you, this is my list. And I think that's revealing in itself.
Did you term out, Linda?
I did. I was on for 3 consecutive 3-year terms. So, I mean, you can go
Wow.
back on. You can
Can
only
you?
be on 9 years at a time. But yeah,
So you're
I
ready for
turned out.
another stint? You're on my list. You might be one of our best bets.
Yeah, and I mean,
Well,
really,
David
we
might be
wouldn't.
another.
Yeah, 100.
Linda and Buck. I think, too, with there's been some confusion about, so the governor has to put forward 3 names each time there's a seat open. And so then it gets into like, well, he's going to have 18 names in mind to fill all 6 positions. Anyways, but essentially, if he picks 3 initially, he can renew 2 of those on his next round down. So at the very end, you might have used up all the ones you had. You wouldn't need 18, long story short. If your top 3 eventually got put on, then you'd have a next top 3. Anyways, that's...
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen that happen. I mean, usually, it used to be the governor put forward 3 good candidates and they would say, this is my first choice, but all of these are qualified people. What we've seen recently is at least Alaska's governor putting forward the person they want and then 2 like state employees or people that are not likely to say yes or be appointed, because there have been times when the secretary maybe doesn't pick their first choice. That happened with the Washington seat last time around, where we had a really strong candidate from the Ocean Conservancy who was the governor's first choice, but then the Secretary of Commerce ended up appointing or reappointing the Trawl rep to the council. So I think some governors, are hedging their bets to make sure they get the person they want when they put forward that slate, which is different from what's historically been done. And the governor also in Washington also put forward 4 names, which, usually it's just 3. I guess nothing says you can't put forward 4. We all found out, but usually they put forward 3.
I think another thing, Melissa, for us to keep reinforcing is that, so like it really came through with this Janesley and Washington when he put forward the Ocean Conservancy person last year. That had historically been a trawl held seat. And so that you'll hear the trawl groups really scream that you can't replace a processor or a trawl seat historically with a sport fish rep or a environmental rep, but there's nothing in Magnuson-Stevens Act that says that. We've looked through it with lawyers a couple times, and that's just historical precedent, but it's not legal, which is important to point out to people as it comes up.
Yeah, those are not designated seats that way. Fisheries are easy, right?
Yeah,
I don't
totally understand 100% of it.
It only gets worse the more you know or see. That's the problem.
It's true, because you got so many different levels with the Board of Fish and the Council and the IPHC, but and up there fighting for stuff. So, but you gotta, why be there if you're not going to make change?
I have nothing but admiration for people who spend their lives doing what you guys do. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for what you're doing. It's for way too long, the council has operated a little bit in a black box, and it's really good to see this much more attention paid to fisheries and the impact of fishery management decisions. I mean, really, it's like probably the most impactful management body in terms of ocean conservation anywhere you could say in the world, because the pollock fishery is the largest fishery in the world. And yet, how many people are paying attention to it? So I think it's really important that there's, the kind of work that you're doing and making people more aware.
Yeah, I think they say Alaska has more coastline than the rest of the United States combined, isn't that the stat?
Yes, and we're responsible for over 60% of U.S. harvest is off our shores. So just a huge impact on the ocean.